It started small, like most good things do. On the corner of my front yard, beneath the shade of a creaking oak tree, I built something that seemed so insignificant at first glance that most people walked right past it without noticing. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even particularly sturdy. It was just a wooden box with a little door, painted bright blue, perched on a post in the soil. But to me, it was a seed, a little free pantry. The idea was simple. Take what you need, leave what you can. I stocked it with canned beans, boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter, and small bags of rice. Sometimes I'd slip in soap, toothbrushes, or other essentials, and over time, neighbors began to add their own contributions. I saw fruit from someone's garden, baby food jars, and fresh bread wrapped carefully in foil. It was quiet, anonymous generosity, the kind that ripples outward without fanfare. At first, I noticed small changes. A single mother from 2 streets over no longer avoided eye contact when we crossed paths. Instead, she'd give me a nod, the kind that carried unspoken gratitude. A retired veteran stopped me once to thank me for the oatmeal packets he found there, the kind that reminded him of home. Kids left hand-drawn thank you notes tucked into the corners. The pantry wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity, hope, and community. But not everyone saw it that way. Not everyone believes kindness should be public. And in my neighborhood, where the HOA and its self-appointed enforcer, Karen, ruled with iron fists and clipped smiles, my little project became a target. Karen, whose real name was longer and less memorable, had earned her reputation over years of relentless nitpicking. To her, a lawn not mowed within 3 days of rain was a crime. A garden gnome was an eyesore. A basketball hoop left out was a violation. She was the kind of neighbor who thrived on control, who carried a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, and who wielded HOA bylaws like weapons. So it wasn't a matter of if she would notice my pantry. It was only a matter of when. The first signs came quietly. A note slipped under my door with words scribbled in red ink. "This is not appropriate for our neighborhood." Then, an email forwarded from the HOA board politely asking me to reconsider the installation of unapproved structures. But I held firm. The pantry wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, it was helping. How could anyone be against feeding the hungry? The answer arrived one humid afternoon when I found the pantry door swinging open, its shelves bare, the wood splintered as though pried apart with force. At first I thought it had been looted by someone desperate. But then I saw it, tucked in the dirt near the broken post. A crumpled paper, torn and stamped with the HOA's logo. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Removed due to nuisance." Nuisance. That was the word Karen used to describe food for hungry families. That was the label she slapped on hope. Neighbors gathered as I stared at the wreckage. Some looked ashamed. Others whispered that they had seen Karen herself, storming across my yard earlier, dragging a crowbar from her garage. No one confronted her. No one challenged her authority. That was Karen's power, her ability to make people shrink, to convince them that resistance was futile. But as I picked up the pieces of that shattered pantry, something hardened inside me. I had started with a small box of food. Karen had smashed it, thinking she had won. But she had only planted a stronger seed. The pantry was gone. Yes, but the need was still there. Families were still hungry. Children still needed milk and cereal. And I still had my yard, my hands, and my resolve. If a little wooden box could shake Karen this much, I wondered how she'd react when kindness grew into something much bigger. That night, I sat at my kitchen table sketching plans on scrap paper. Not for another pantry. Not for something small and easy to tear down, but for something permanent. Something Karen couldn't break with a crowbar and a smug smile. I envisioned a space where people could gather, where no one had to hide their struggles, where food was not charity, but community. A kitchen, not in the sense of my own home, but a communal kitchen, built on trust, generosity, and resilience. The road to building it would not be easy. I knew the HOA would fight me. I knew Karen would call it a violation of every bylaw she could dig up. And I knew there would be whispers, accusations, and pressure to back down. But I also knew something else, something Karen had forgotten. When people are fed, they are stronger. When people unite, They are unstoppable. The broken pantry was not an ending. It was the beginning of something Karen couldn't imagine, and as I swept the splinters into a box that night, I wasn't grieving. I was planning, because if Karen thought feeding the hungry was a nuisance, then she hadn't seen what real community looked like yet. And soon, she would. The morning after Karen destroyed the pantry, I woke to a silence heavier than usual, the kind that made every creak of the floorboards sound like thunder. I looked out the window at the empty patch of dirt beneath the oak tree where my little pantry once stood. The space felt hollow, stripped not only of food but of the hope it represented. Yet staring at that void, I didn't feel defeated. I felt determined. I spent hours that day sketching, measuring, and researching. I knew a replacement pantry wouldn't be enough. Karen would destroy it again and again and again. She thrived on small victories. But if I built something bigger, something permanent, she wouldn't be able to tear it down so easily. I envisioned a community kitchen, a place that wasn't just a box of food but a hub of connection. A space where people could cook together, share meals, and find dignity in times of struggle. The first step was finding allies. I began quietly, testing the waters with neighbors I trusted. I spoke to the single mother who had once left notes of thanks in the pantry, to the veteran who smiled when I handed him oatmeal, to the elderly woman who sometimes slipped loaves of bread into the shelves. They didn't hesitate. They told me stories I hadn't heard before, about the weeks they'd gone without enough groceries, about the shame they felt in asking for help, about how that little box had made them feel seen. And each one said the same thing. We need this. Word spread quietly at first. People came to me with donations, offers of labor, even unused appliances they no longer needed. It was as if the destruction of the pantry had ripped the lid off something much larger than food insecurity. It had revealed how much people longed for connection, for a space where kindness wasn't policed. But while the whispers of support grew, so too did the pushback. Karen was relentless. I received an official HOA violation notice in the mail, accusing me of maintaining structures detrimental to neighborhood aesthetics. She hadn't even waited for me to build anything new. Just the idea that I might was enough to provoke her. Then came the threats. Fines, escalating fees, even the possibility of legal action. Karen wielded the HOA bylaws like a sword, convinced she could cut down my plans before they had roots. She showed up at my door one evening, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tightly they looked carved from stone. Though she didn't speak, she slipped another notice into my mailbox, this one warning of escalated enforcement. But for every notice Karen dropped, a neighbor dropped off supplies. For every threat she scribbled in red ink, another pair of hands volunteered to help. It became clear to me that Karen wasn't fighting me alone. She was fighting the neighborhood itself, whether she realized it or not. I began organizing meetings in my backyard. We kept them small at first, a handful of neighbors huddled around a picnic table with cups of coffee. We discussed logistics, where the kitchen might go, how it could be funded, who would oversee it. Some suggested using my garage as a starting point, others offered their own backyards. A retired contractor volunteered to help with construction. A teacher offered to run cooking classes once the kitchen was ready. Ideas spilled out faster than I could write them down. It was in those meetings that the word community began to take on a new weight. This wasn't just my project anymore, it was ours, but Karen was watching. She lurked at the edges of our gatherings, pretending to water her flowers while glaring across the fence. Once, she even called the HOA board mid-meeting, filing a complaint about unauthorized assemblies. We laughed at her attempts, but beneath the humor was an undercurrent of tension. Karen wasn't going to stop, and the HOA, with its vague rules and strict enforcement, was a powerful weapon in her hands. The breaking point came when I received a letter not just from Karen, but from the HOA's lawyer. It cited obscure regulations about non-residential use of private property and warned me that if I pursued communal operations, I could face litigation. It was clear Karen had escalated. She wasn't just trying to stop me from building a kitchen. She was trying to scare me into silence. That night, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by blueprints, notes, and half-empty mugs of coffee. Doubt gnawed at me. Could I really stand against the HOA? Could I risk fines, lawsuits, maybe even losing my home? The weight pressed down heavy, threatening to snuff out the fire inside me. But then I remembered the faces, the mother clutching milk from the pantry with tears in her eyes, the veteran who found comfort in oatmeal, the notes from children thanking me for peanut butter sandwiches. I remembered the voices in my backyard, rising together with hope stronger than fear, and I realized something Karen had never understood. Fear only works when it isolates. But community, true community, binds people together. And bound together, we were stronger than any bylaw, any clipboard, any crowbar. The next morning, I sent out messages to every neighbor who had ever used or supported the pantry. I invited them to a gathering, not in secret this time, not hushed or hidden. This time it would be open, loud, public. We weren't going to whisper about kindness anymore. We were going to declare it. Karen wanted me to back down. Instead, I was going to step forward. And as the sun rose that morning, glinting off the empty patch of dirt where the pantry once stood, I saw it not as a grave, but as fertile ground. The pantry was gone, yes, but something far larger was about to take its place. Karen thought she had ended this, but she had only just begun the fight that would transform our neighborhood forever. The gathering began on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning that carried a faint breeze and the smell of cut grass. I had expected maybe a dozen people to show up, enough to prove we weren't alone, but not enough to attract too much attention. Instead, as I set out folding chairs and a borrowed podium in my front yard, the crowd kept growing. Neighbors from every corner of the subdivision arrived, some carrying children, others balancing trays of food, a few hauling coolers filled with bottled water. It wasn't just familiar faces either. People I had never spoken to before. Families who usually kept their blinds closed. Retirees who rarely left their porches. Even teenagers who were usually glued to their phones stood together, shoulder to shoulder. They weren't here for me. They were here for what the pantry had meant, for what the kitchen could become. The HOA had always counted on silence and compliance. Today the silence broke. I took a breath and stepped forward. The words I had rehearsed in my head all week spilled out, not as a speech, but as a promise. I spoke of the pantry, of the needs it had revealed, of the community that had blossomed around it. I spoke of the kitchen we could build, not a charity, but a commons, a place for everyone. As I finished, a ripple of applause surged through the crowd, hesitant at first, then louder, until it rolled like thunder across the cul-de-sac. I looked out at their faces and saw something Karen could never destroy: belief. But belief alone doesn't build walls or wire stoves. So we set to work. That afternoon, teams formed. One neighbor offered their truck for supply runs. Another, a retired electrician, volunteered to handle wiring. Someone else, who owned a catering business, promised to donate old but working appliances. A couple of teenagers offered to paint murals once construction was done. The project became real, no longer sketches on my kitchen table, but actions taking root in soil and sweat. We decided the best place to begin was my garage. It was spacious, underused, and most importantly, mine. We would retrofit it, turning it into a makeshift kitchen that could later grow into something larger. People showed up with toolboxes, measuring tape, even extra tiles. Within hours, the garage that once held nothing more than dusty bikes and broken shelves had become a work site buzzing with energy. But for every brick we laid, Karen was ready with a stone to throw. She appeared midway through the first day of work, striding across my lawn with her clipboard tucked under one arm like a shield. Her voice carried above the hum of drills and hammers, barking about unpermitted construction and illegal modifications. She threatened to call city inspectors, the HOA board, even the police. She snapped photos with her phone, documenting every nail and every face. The workers, neighbors, friends, paused, uneasy under her glare. For a moment, the energy faltered, and I felt the project teeter on the edge of collapse. Karen fed on hesitation. She wanted us to believe her power was absolute, that she alone could dictate what belonged in our neighborhood. But then, something unexpected happened. The veteran, the same man who had once thanked me for oatmeal, stepped forward. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood between Karen and the workers, arms folded across his chest. His presence alone was enough to steady the others. One by one, tools clattered back into motion, saws buzzed, hammers pounded. Karen's words drowned beneath the sound of progress. For once, Karen didn't have the last word. She retreated, sputtering about violations as she stormed back toward her immaculate lawn. But the message was clear. She wasn't done. She would come back, stronger, sharper, more determined to shut us down. We worked late into the evening, light spilling from the garage as neighbors passed out sandwiches and cold drinks. Laughter mingled with exhaustion, the kind of laughter that only comes when people feel they're part of something bigger than themselves. The kitchen was still just a skeleton of wood and wires, but already it had life. Already it had spirit. As I looked around at the sweat-streaked faces illuminated by work lights, I realized the kitchen wasn't just about food anymore. It was a statement. A declaration that kindness couldn't be bulldozed, that generosity couldn't be fined, that community couldn't be silenced. But Karen wasn't finished. That night, long after the last neighbor had gone home, I noticed something strange. A pair of headlights creeping slowly past my house, pausing by the garage before disappearing into the dark. Twice more, the same car circled, its silhouette sharp against the glow of streetlights. I didn't need to guess who it was. Karen was watching, plotting. And if her crowbar had shattered a pantry, I knew she would try something far more destructive against a kitchen. For now, though, as I stood in the doorway of my half-finished garage, I let myself feel a flicker of hope. The first stone had been laid. The first walls had been raised. For a brief moment, it felt like we were unstoppable. The garage was transforming faster than I dared to imagine. New wiring hummed quietly in the walls. Countertops, donated by a neighbor who had recently remodeled, gleamed beneath temporary work lights. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with the faint aroma of soup simmering in a borrowed slow cooker, as if the space already knew its purpose. But progress attracts resistance. And Karen was sharpening her claws. The first strike came in the form of letters. Thick envelopes with the HOA's crest stamped urgent arrived almost daily. Each one cited a new violation. Unauthorized gatherings, unapproved construction, excessive noise. The fines escalated rapidly. Small at first, $50 here, $100 there, but by the end of the second week, the total balance listed was over $2,000. It was clear what they were doing, bleed us dry financially until the kitchen collapsed under debt. I knew these fines weren't just paperwork. They were weapons, wielded by Karen, who sat on the board's enforcement committee. She had turned a neighbor's project into a full-blown HOA crusade. Then came the inspectors. One afternoon, as volunteers were laying tile, two men in city uniforms appeared at the end of the driveway. Their clipboards mirrored Karen's, though their authority was far greater. She had reported us to the zoning department, claiming we were operating a commercial enterprise on residential property. The men walked through the garage, snapping photos, jotting notes. Their faces gave nothing away, but the silence that followed their departure was heavy with dread. The blow landed 2 days later. A cease and desist order nailed to my front door. Effective immediately, all construction was to stop. Any further work would be considered unlawful. The words burned like acid in my chest. The neighborhood felt the impact instantly. Volunteers drifted away, their enthusiasm dampened by fear of fines or legal trouble. Supplies sat unused in stacks, gathering dust. The garage, once alive with hammering and laughter, became eerily quiet. Even the children who had once drawn colorful chalk designs on the driveway avoided the space as though it carried a curse. And through it all, Karen watched. From her porch, from her car, from behind the blinds of her pristine living room, she observed the unraveling with the smugness of someone who believed victory was inevitable. She had turned the HOA's bureaucracy into a cage around us, and for the first time, I wondered if the kitchen might die before it ever truly lived. But even in defeat, sparks remained. The retired contractor who had helped frame the walls came to me late one evening when the cul-de-sac was quiet. He told me not to lose heart, that battles worth fighting were never easy. He reminded me that Karen's power wasn't as absolute as it seemed. Rules could be challenged, bylaws rewritten, decisions overturned. He offered to connect me with a lawyer friend who specialized in standing up to overreaching HOAs. At the same time, small acts of defiance began to surface. The single mother who once relied on the pantry left bags of groceries at my doorstep, whispering that she didn't care what Karen thought. The veteran fixed a leaky pipe in the garage under the cover of night, insisting the project wasn't dead, only paused. Teenagers posted pictures online of the kitchen in progress, tagging them with captions about community over control. The kitchen had been stopped on paper, but in spirit it was still alive. Karen, of course, wasn't satisfied with paper victories. She wanted destruction. One night, under the cover of darkness, she struck again. I woke to the acrid smell of gasoline and the sight of blackened scorch marks across the driveway. Someone had tried to burn the stack of donated wood left outside. The fire hadn't spread far, thanks to the quick response of a neighbor who spotted it from her window, but the message was undeniable. But the real battle, the one Karen was preparing to fight, was only just beginning. This wasn't just about bylaws anymore. It was personal. Fear rippled through the neighborhood. If Karen was willing to stoop this low, what else might she do? Parents kept their children closer. Volunteers hesitated to come back. The sense of unity that had burned so brightly was flickering, fragile. I sat in the dark that night, staring at the charred remains of wood, my hands trembling with rage. Karen had crossed a line. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was terrorizing it. And yet part of me knew this was her mistake. She had revealed the truth of who she was, and in doing so, she had given me a weapon stronger than any rule book, the truth. I began documenting everything: photos of the fire damage, copies of the violation letters, witness statements from neighbors. If Karen wanted to fight in the shadows of bylaws and whispers, I would drag her into the light. The contractor's lawyer friend agreed to meet, and together we began building a case, not just for the kitchen, but against Karen herself. Still, the kitchen remained unfinished, its walls half-built, its promise unfulfilled. Every time I walked past the garage, I felt the weight of that emptiness. For the first time, doubt sank its claws deep. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe this neighborhood wasn't ready for something bigger than rules and regulations. Maybe kindness didn't belong here. But then, as if to answer my doubt, I found something taped to the half-finished wall of the garage the next morning. A child's drawing scrawled in bright crayon. It showed a house with a giant table outside, people of all ages sitting together, smiling, with the words "Community Kitchen" written across the top. It was simple. It was messy. But it was hope. And it was a reminder that this fight wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who believed in what the pantry had started. Karen had won this round. She had silenced the hammers, emptied the garage, and scattered the volunteers. But she hadn't destroyed the idea, and as long as the idea lived, the kitchen still had a chance to rise. The garage sat still for weeks, a silent skeleton of what it was meant to be. Dust settled on countertops. The donated appliances sat unused, their cords coiled like snakes. Neighbors walked by quickly, heads down, unwilling to linger too long near the space Karen had declared a violation. The cease and desist nailed to my door seemed to hang heavier with each passing day. But silence is never permanent. Beneath the surface, change was stirring. The lawyer, a graying man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, sifted through every violation notice, every fine, every threatening email. He explained something I hadn't known. HOAs may look invincible, but they were bound by law, too. And in our case, the board had overstepped. Karen had used her position not to uphold community standards, but to push her own personal agenda. That wasn't just unfair, it was abuse of authority. We filed a formal challenge. At first, it felt like tossing a pebble at a mountain. But within days, word spread. Copies of our filing leaked into neighbors' hands. People began whispering not about fear of Karen, but about her corruption. Stories surfaced, how she had fined a neighbor for a children's swing set while allowing her own extended fence to remain untouched. How she had bent rules for friends but enforced them ruthlessly against others. The cracks in her authority began to show, and then came the moment that changed everything. One of the teenagers who had once painted chalk designs outside the garage posted a video online. It showed the pantry before Karen destroyed it, the empty patch of dirt afterward, and the beginnings of the community kitchen before construction was shut down. The video wasn't flashy, just simple clips stitched together with captions that asked a single question. Why would anyone stop this? Within hours, it spread beyond our neighborhood. Thousands of views turned into tens of thousands. Comments poured in from people across the country, angry, supportive, inspired. Strangers donated money to a crowdfunding page the teenagers had set up. Local reporters caught wind, and soon cameras appeared on our street, filming the half-finished garage and interviewing neighbors. Karen had ruled our cul-de-sac through fear and silence. But under the glare of public attention, her power began to wither. She tried to fight back, of course. She called the video misinformation. She accused us of exploiting charity for personal gain. She threatened to sue the teenagers who posted it. But her words sounded shrill against the images of canned goods, drawings from children, and testimonies of neighbors who had relied on the pantry. For the first time, people weren't listening to her. They were listening to each other. The community rallied. Volunteers returned, no longer in secret but in defiance. Neighbors who had once stayed out of sight marched right into my driveway with paint rollers, hammers, and groceries. The garage buzzed with energy again, louder this time, bolder. It wasn't just about building a kitchen anymore. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood from fear. The HOA board, under mounting pressure from both residents and reporters, scheduled an emergency meeting. Karen sat at the center of the long table, her clipboard stacked high with papers. But she didn't hold the room the way she used to. Eyes that once followed her lead now looked at her with suspicion, even disdain. One by one, neighbors spoke. They told stories of hunger eased by the pantry, of generosity crushed by Karen's crowbar, of hope rekindled by the kitchen. They spoke of fines, intimidation, and hypocrisy. And finally, the lawyer presented the evidence, pages of overreach, favoritism, and abuse of power. The board shifted uneasily. The decision wasn't immediate, but it was clear. Karen's grip was slipping. The very next day, a letter arrived. Not a violation notice, not a threat, but a ruling. The cease and desist was lifted. The kitchen, so long as it remained non-profit and volunteer-run, could continue construction. The HOA had been forced to yield. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. Children drew colorful murals across the driveway. Neighbors clapped each other on the back, some even crying openly. Strangers arrived with donations, hands full of groceries, tools, and money. The kitchen was alive again, but not everyone celebrated. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, her face a storm of rage. She had lost the battle for control, but her eyes made a promise. The war wasn't over. And as I looked back at her, I realized something important. She wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting against an idea too large for her clipboard to contain. The kitchen was bigger than me, bigger than her, bigger than the HOA. It was community itself, and community had just found its voice. The walls would rise higher now. The tables would be set. The kitchen would open. But I knew Karen wasn't finished. She had lost her authority. Now she would try to destroy us with desperation. Weeks that followed felt like a dream taking shape in wood, steel, and laughter. The garage was no longer just a garage. It had become something unrecognizable, something alive. Bright murals painted by neighborhood kids covered the walls, bursts of color that told the story of resilience. Long counters gleamed, appliances hummed, and the smell of bread baking in donated ovens spilled into the street. Neighbors worked side by side, some cooking, others cleaning, all united by a single purpose. Even strangers who had read about the fight online showed up with boxes of food or simply rolled up their sleeves to help. What once had been a lonely battle was now a movement, buzzing with the kind of energy Karen could never silence. The grand opening of the community kitchen was set for a Saturday afternoon. Flyers spread across town. Local reporters promised coverage. Restaurants donated food, musicians volunteered to play, and families brought their children, eager to be part of history. It wasn't just about feeding the hungry anymore. It was about proving that kindness, once planted, could bloom into something unstoppable. But Karen wasn't finished. In the days leading up to the opening, she grew bolder, more reckless. She filed last-minute complaints with the city, each one dismissed as baseless. She tried to rally support from other board members, but they had distanced themselves after the hearing. She even stood outside my house, hurling accusations at neighbors as they carried food inside, calling us lawbreakers and troublemakers. Her desperation came to a head on the morning of the opening. As volunteers set out tables in the driveway, we heard the growl of an engine. Karen's SUV barreled down the street, swerving toward the curb. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though she might plow straight into the setup. At the last second, she slammed the brakes, tires screeching. She leapt out, screaming about illegal gatherings and safety hazards, waving a stack of papers in the air. Her voice cracked as she demanded everyone leave, insisting the event was canceled. But something was different this time. No one moved. Instead, the crowd turned, not toward me, but toward her. Dozens of neighbors, families, children, even the veteran who had once stood between her and the workers. They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They simply stood together, a wall of calm defiance. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, reporters scribbled. Karen's tantrum wasn't hidden behind bylaws or whispered threats anymore. It was exposed, raw, undeniable. She screamed until her voice broke, then finally retreated to her SUV, slamming the door so hard it rattled. The engine roared, and she sped off, leaving behind nothing but the bitter stench of burned rubber. And just like that, the last shadow lifted. The opening went forward, brighter than we could have imagined. Music drifted into the air, mingling with the smell of fresh food. Tables overflowed with casseroles, bread, fruit, and steaming pots of soup. Children laughed as they painted welcome signs. Families sat together, strangers shared meals, and for the first time in a long time, our neighborhood felt whole. Reporters captured it all, the joy, the unity, the defiance of a community that refused to be broken. The story spread beyond our town, sparking conversations about kindness, about control, about what it means to truly be neighbors. Donations poured in from across the country, ensuring the kitchen wouldn't just survive but thrive for years to come. And as I stood beneath the oak tree where it had all started, I thought of the little blue pantry. It had been small, fragile, easy to tear down. But from its ashes rose something so much larger than Karen, or even I, had ever imagined. Karen faded after that day. She still lived across the street, but her power was gone. Neighbors no longer feared her clipboard. The HOA stripped her of her position. She became a spectator, forced to watch as the community she tried to control blossomed without her. The kitchen became more than a building. It became a heartbeat. No family in our town went to bed hungry again. Parents found relief, children found joy, strangers found connection. And every time a meal was served, every time laughter echoed. Through those walls it was a reminder. What Karen tried to destroy had only grown stronger. Because kindness cannot be bulldozed, generosity cannot be fined, and community, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The pantry was gone, but the kitchen, the dream, the promise, the table set for all was here to stay.